Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we're very delighted to be hosting Steven Brill, who's here to talk about his new book, The Death of Truth. Now, Steven was educated as a lawyer, but soon after graduating from law school, he became a journalist and media entrepreneur. And the list of publications, programs, and enterprises he's created over the years is quite impressive. Back in the late 1970s, he started the American Lawyer to cover the business of law firms and lawyers. In 1991, he launched Court TV, and in 1998, he introduced Brill's Content, which is a media watchdog publication. Nearly 20 years ago, he gave Yale a bunch of money to establish a program to teach and provide career guidance to students interested in journalism. And then a few years later, he created Journalism Online to help newspapers and magazines charge for online access. 6 years ago, he co-founded NewsGuard to rate the trustworthiness of the most visited news and information websites. And he's also engaged in some ventures outside of journalism, notably his founding of the company Clear, which through pre-screening allows passengers to get through airport security more quickly. A number of you may be members of Clear. Along the way, Steven's done his own reporting and written 5 books previously on a range of topics. The Teamsters, How America Coped with the 9/11 Attacks, Teachers' Unions, the U.S. healthcare system, and America's decline in a number of areas over the past half century. In The Death of Truth, he examines why, as he puts it in the first sentence, facts have lost their power to hold us together. Of course, there's been a tendency, long been a tendency among some to deny reality and not face the facts. But what's truly alarming and damaging to our democracy, as Steven notes, is how widespread distortions, falsehoods, and conspiracy theories have become. And amping up the spread of misinformation and disinformation are social media platforms, often being exploited by powerful business, political, and foreign government interests. And with the development of generative AI, Steven says the problem only is going to get worse. Typical of Steven's writing, his book is based on a lot of data and reporting, much of it derived from the work of one of the organizations he created, NewsGuard. But lest we all despair, Steven, after thoroughly diagnosing the problem, does include at the end of his book a discussion of what can be done to, as he puts it, reverse engineer the forces that have combined to undermine truth and trust. So be sure to read that last chapter. And hopefully we can touch on some of the suggested fixes in the discussion this evening. Now, moderating the discussion will be one of America's most experienced and capable journalists, Al Hunt. Al spent 40 years with the Wall Street Journal, 35 of them right here in DC as a national reporter, bureau chief, and executive Washington editor. He also wrote a weekly column for a while in the Journal called Politics and People. Later, he joined Bloomberg News, where he worked for 13 years. In recent years, he's been doing, among other things, a podcast with James Carville. And no doubt he's familiar to many of you for his role as a host or panelist on several TV talk shows. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve Brill and Al Hunt.
Well, Brad, what a nice introduction. How much of it about me do you think is true? Yeah, exactly. Boy, boy, Steve, you really can draw them. Would you look at this? I mean, this is like
A lot of family members.
It
A lot
is.
of family members.
I'll be brief in the introduction because Brad already covered it. Steve Brill's a legend. He really is. There's been no one who has been more central to the intersection of news and technology and now disinformation over the years and the law than Steve Brill. He founded the American Lawyer, Court TV, and now is CEO of NewsGuard, which is really a fascinating site on the reliability of various news venues. Some of it you may not like, but all of it's very, very well done. And the author of this book, The Death of Truth, about how social media, programmatic advertising, cable television, among others, spread disinformation and really debase the value of truth. Steve, years ago, we recall that the great Daniel Patrick Moynihan said everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. That almost seems quaint today.
Well, it seems so quaint that one of the points I try to make in the book is that for many, many people, there isn't a difference between opinion and facts. So, Senator Moynihan was on to something, but it's gone much further than that, which is to say that everything is an opinion now. Who got the most votes in Pennsylvania in 2020? That's your opinion. That's my opinion. Did Hank Aaron die from a COVID vaccine? He didn't, but that's my opinion. Maybe you have an opinion about that. Did Vladimir Zelensky get $200 million to buy 2 luxury yachts in France? In my opinion, he didn't, because our journalist actually interviewed the people who own those yachts, and guess what? They haven't sold them to Vladimir Zelensky or anybody else. But that's just my opinion. Your opinion might be, if you have a Facebook account, or if you're J.D. Vance, who recently repeated this, that Zelensky did get the $200 million.
The microphone isn't on?
No, it's on. It says sometimes if you don't hold it right up.
My apologies. I'll do better. You don't want me to repeat any of that, though, do you? Okay.
Hey, guys, he's a rookie. Give him a break, okay?
Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, I'll do my best.
But no, well, to pick up on that, social media, which brought a lot of good things to enable people to communicate, enable people in North Dakota to have the same information to some extent as people in Washington. But it can be an insidious force. In 2016, a friend of mine told me, Steve, right before the election, she called her mother, who was a lifelong Democrat in Ohio, and her mother said, "I'm voting for Donald Trump." And she said, "Why?" She said, "Because the Pope has endorsed Trump." That was a story that gained more currency for 3 or 4 weeks than almost anything else. And it's just symptomatic of what happens in some of the illustrations, the many illustrations that you have in this book.
That was a story, by the way, planted in that notable newspaper, the Denver Guardian, on their website. The Denver Guardian does not exist. The website exists. Today, as we speak today, we've just passed a milestone in this country where there are more fake sites posing as local news sites in the United States of America than there are local news sites operated by legitimate local news operations in the United States of America. Many of them are funded by left-wing groups of political action committees that I'm betting that half or 2/3 of you might otherwise support. A bunch of them are funded by right-wing political action committees. In neither instance do they in any way disclose their funding, but instead they look like local news, and they publish stories of their favorite candidate. Let's say it's a Democrat swing congressional district, going to a ribbon cutting of a senator to feed the homeless, whereas his Republican opponent is mired in a high school cheating scandal. All of this sponsored by political action committees, again, on the left and on the right. But there's now a third player, which has driven the numbers over the top, which is the Russians. The Russians have launched in the last 2 months 167 fake news sites in the United States posing as local news, running stories, for example, that the Secret Service discovered recently that when the FBI served the search warrant on Mar-a-Lago, in addition to all the other horrible things the FBI did when they served that search warrant, they also planted bugging devices in all of the rooms in Mar-a-Lago. So the Biden administration has been able to listen in on Donald Trump since that search warrant was served. That is Russian propaganda designed, again, to create all kinds of dissension and designed, to come back to your question, to make it so that there are no facts.
How many people here had heard of that story that Steve just told about the Russian disinformation? See, but this is a really well-educated and and a very interested group, and you've had 3 or 4. And you write about this in the book. Part of the problem, Steve, is a lack of transparency. And with the exception of the stuff you're doing, there are not very many people really exposing this.
Well, that's right. And, that's an awareness of the irresponsibility of the social media platforms, because if the social media platforms didn't post that kind of information from the news websites that are, quote, reporting it, those websites would be out of business. So what do I mean by that? The way that these hoax websites, the Russians don't care that much about it, but other hoax websites do. The way they get financed is through something called programmatic advertising. And programmatic advertising is advertising via an auction using all kinds of data about you. It's an algorithm. So if an advertiser wants to reach someone, let's say the advertiser is BMW, and they want to reach someone who recently went on the Lexus website and lives in New Jersey and is between 35 and 55 years old. I'm making this up. They have that demographic. They can pinpoint ads directly to that person, no matter where he or she is looking at content. So the website will post the most inflammatory content. They'll put that on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, whose business it is to feature the most inflammatory content, because that's how they get the most eyeballs and the most advertising revenue. Someone will look at it on Facebook, go to that website, and that website will get advertising revenue. I mean, that is how this works. And in writing the book and in doing our work at NewsGuard, it really hit me over the head that the element that is frequently ignored is the financial element, the programmatic advertising side of this. Just to give you one example, who can tell me, who would you imagine was, and you can't, if you've heard any of my other talks, you can't answer this. Who would you imagine was the largest single financial supporter a couple of years ago of Sputnik News, which is the premier Russian propaganda site? Anybody have a guess?
I read it in your book. It's Warren Buffett.
No, the icon of American capitalism, Warren Buffett. Because Warren Buffett, among other things, owns Geico, the giant insurance company that's a few miles down the road here. And Geico, by the way, which stands for Government Employees Insurance Company, was founded on the basis of serving the military in the United States with cost-effective insurance, not serving the military's adversaries in the Soviet Union or in Russia. But Geico is a major programmatic advertiser. In 1 year, they were at the top of all the advertisers that were financing Russian propaganda. Pretty much every brand name you can think of is on that list of advertisers because their ad agencies, their highest profit margins come from programmatic advertising. None of it is accountable. And that is now how the system works. And that's something that you should all pay attention to, and you should all ask your favorite brands where they're advertising. Now, by the way, everything I have just said to you is completely self-serving. Because NewsGuard has a product, because we rate all the websites for reliability, we have a product which is data that can serve as a filter so that before you turn on your programmatic advertising machine, you can use our filter to filter out, the sites like Russian propaganda sites, or if you're Pfizer, you probably don't want to be advertising on a site that says that Colin Powell died from a COVID vaccine, which he didn't. Or if you're Sloan Kettering, you probably don't want to be advertising on a site that says your oncologists are just ripping you off. If you buy these apricot pits, it'll cure your cancer. That's real, by the way. I'm not making that up.
Steve, Geico would say, well, this was unwitting. Well,
It was unwitting. It is unwitting.
Well, but it's now witting because
Right.
we know about it. And does it change habits when it's revealed, when it's exposed?
It should, but the system is so opaque. I mean, I'll tell you there's another story that I can illustrate better because it's got real detail. You all remember when Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked in his home? So when the night he was attacked, a fake local news site called the Santa Monica Observer ran a story that said he was actually the victim of a gay prostitute. A gay prostitute. You're going to make me repeat that again? So
it's untrue.
It's untrue. It was quickly retweeted by Elon Musk, by Donald Trump Jr. It went totally viral, and hundreds of thousands of dollars of programmatic advertising went to the Santa Monica Observer. Now, NewsGuard had rated the Observer very low beginning years before because it had run stories. Among them was that Hillary Clinton had died in 2015 and a body double had participated in the 2016 debates with President Trump. So it already had a red rating from us. Didn't matter. It got tons of programmatic advertising because by posting its headline about Paul Pelosi on Twitter and Facebook, everybody clicked to read the story. Bingo, they got all this programmatic advertising. The websites that didn't get that programmatic advertising, for example, would be the San Francisco Chronicle, which actually pays real reporters to write real stories, including what had actually happened to Paul Pelosi. So that's how infected the system is.
And it continues. I mean, there is no...
Well,
and
I'm sorry.
Okay.
So just to finish the story, it turns out through a friend of mine, Jeff Sonnenfeld, who teaches at Yale, who's a friend of mine, he is friendly with the CEO of Hertz and put me in touch with the CEO of Hertz and said, he's going to want to know this. Oh, my God. Why would he want to advertise there? Of course, he didn't know they had advertised there. So I get on a Zoom with him, and the first thing he says is, oh, my God, it's such a pleasure to meet you. You've changed my life. I was a law student, and I read The American Lawyer, and it helped me decide what law firm to go to, blah, 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 blah. It's just so great to meet you. What's going on? So I tell him this story. He said, it's impossible. We would never want to advertise on that. I said, well, you did. And he calls in his chief marketing officer. He says, well, that must be a glitch. I'll talk to the ad agency. The ad agency, A, is mortally embarrassed. B, is really angry at us because we've embarrassed them. They're supposed to be placing ads for Hertz. And they They talk to us, and 2 months later, they write us back saying this was just one ad that appeared. It was it slipped through the system. The day we get that email, we go to the Santa Monica Observer, and there are Hertz ads all over the Santa Monica. So we go back to the CEO, and he says, well, I've got to rely on my marketing people and my ad agency. And besides, everybody else is advertising all over these places. So Hertz does nothing. Go figure.
Well, we're going to get into solutions in a few minutes, but let's just hold that thought that whether the government can do something about programmatic advertising. But Steve, let me ask you to switch to NewsGuard, and you do rate the truthfulness of various news venues, among other things. Cable news fares very poorly. Both Fox and MSNBC fare poorly because they mix opinion and facts. Actually, MSNBC does even worse than Fox in your rating. So talk about that.
I wouldn't say they fare very poorly, because in a world in which OAN and Newsmax exist, Fox and MSNBC look pretty good.
MSNBC was, I think, 42%. That's
47, I think now.
Well,
Maybe
still
it's
below 50.
Well, that's because what happens is that Joe Scarborough makes a mistake about every 5 minutes, and one of our standards, one of our 9 criteria, is the standard, journalistic criteria of, do you correct mistakes, and are you candid about the mistakes you've made? Now, I'm now convinced, having run some control rooms when I operated a cable television channel, that the control room at MSNBC is terrified of Joe Scarborough. Don't tell him I said that, but that's my theory of the case, and they have never corrected any of his mistakes. He, for example, just one that comes to mind, he repeatedly said that Steve Bannon was convicted of fraud in that thing about, the donations for building the wall. Well, Steve Bannon may be guilty of a lot of things, but he wasn't convicted. He was indicted, and then he was pardoned. We take that seriously. That's a mistake. Easy to correct that mistake, but if you don't, you lose points from us.
Yeah.
But to come back to your broader question about the cable channels, first of all, we rate the websites. We also rate different programs on the cable networks. It's a separate kind of rating we do, but it's always without regard to politics. So it turns out that Fox, after we gave them 1 rating, they engage with us, because everything we do is totally transparent. We want people to game our system. We want them to say, gee, if I had a corrections policy, I could get a higher score from NewsGuard. Or if I talked about and revealed the backgrounds and credentials of the people creating our content, I get a higher score. Or if I made my headlines more consistent with the story, I get a higher score. So Fox engaged with us, and we said, among the things we said was, this fair and balanced thing, which is your motto, there isn't any serious person that actually believes that, and that's not really revealing what your point of view is. And if you're a news operation that has an agenda, has a point of view, that's fine, but you should disclose it to your readers. To take one example, the National Review actually reprints right on its website the original Bill Buckley manifesto for the National Review. So they're conservative, but they take their work seriously, and they get a high rating. So we go to Fox and say, you've got to sort of do something about this. And now, if you go to the About section of foxnews.com, they say we approach things from a conservative free market point of view. MSNBC, no such disclosure. We met with people at we met with people at NBC News. You'll get a kick out of this. And I said, your About thing is just so, bland. It says, we report the news, we report straight news. We don't have any agenda. We don't have any this and that. That may be true of NBC News. certainly not true, whether you like them or not, of MSNBC. So I said, it's easier. You just have to say who you are. And they admitted in this conversation, well, we're sort of the op-ed page of NBC News, and we take a liberal point of view about everything. I said, fine, so tell your readers that. And they said, oh, no, we couldn't possibly do that because the people who work at NBC, as opposed to MSNBC, would never tolerate that.
Well, when I watch Fox, I don't approve of a lot of the evening fare, to put it mildly, but I know what it is.
That stuff's most of that stuff's not on their website. We rate those television shows separately.
Right. Well, I know what
Hannity is about a 0.
When I tune into Laura Ingraham or Hannity, I know what I'm getting. They're not deceiving me. I think they're deceiving their viewers, but they aren't pretending to be something that they really aren't. And really the same thing with Rachel Maddow on. And what I find troubling is when they report on the story, then it gets, and I guess it's true on the website as well. It totally mixes opinion and facts.
Well, that's right. And part of the reason I think readers, news consumers lose when that happens, even if you agree with them. I don't know about you, but I think the most useful way to test your own ideas and the most useful way to be informed is to hear what the other guy says, as opposed to, stacking, 6 guests in a row who say the exact same thing, with different levels of, vitriol, as opposed to hearing, both sides. Now, that doesn't mean that we should go back to what was the famous CNN show?
The Carville
Crossfire.
Yeah.
I got kicked off of Crossfire once because I changed my mind about something and ended up agreeing with the other guy. It was about whether there should be cameras in the Senate deliberations over the Clinton trial, the impeachment. And since I was running court TV, they asked me on because they figured, well, you favor cameras everywhere, and I realized that the Senate deliberations, not the trial, but the Senate deliberations was sort of like the jury room, and you don't want cameras there. So, Crossfire was set up a certain way. This guy was here and this guy was here, and Senator, I'm forgetting his name, from Pennsylvania, used to be the prosecutor and the mayor.
Arlen Specter.
Yeah, thank you. Arlen Specter was on, and he gave a really articulate explanation of why there certainly shouldn't be cameras in the process in which the senators are deliberating over their impeachment vote. And then Michael Kinsley turned to me and said, "Well, Mr. Brill, what do you think?" I said, come to think of it, I think he's right. And the producer's screaming in my ear, "You're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to say that." They cut the show. Kinsley thought it was hilarious, by the way. They cut the show, and on my way out, the producer says, "You will never be on this show again. How could you have done this?" I said, well, every once in a while when you listen to someone, maybe you hear the other side and maybe you agree with it. Why is that such a horrible thing? Well, we are so far away from that now, today, in every aspect of life, of politics, medicine, commerce, culture, healthcare. Whoever thought that whether a vaccine works would be a political issue?
It's really remarkable. My dad was a pediatrician, and I remember when the measles vaccine came out. There were a couple nuts who complained about it, but it really didn't amount to anything. The Salk vaccine was embraced by President Eisenhower, but it's different today. Let's stay on politics for a minute. Donald Trump did not start or invent misinformation, and there are plenty of liberal as well as conservative examples. But he has taken it, I think, Steve, to a new level for a politician. That Obama was not born in this country, that he won the 2020 election, that January 6th was really a peaceful protest. I spent almost 2 decades directing political coverage. I'm goddamn glad I don't do it now. It's really hard when you have someone who is, frankly, just simply a pathological liar. So what do you say
Is
to
there a
those?
question in there?
No, there is a question in there. I know it is how. Oh, I'll give you an example, Steve. You all went and you downgraded the New York Times. They still had a very high grade
Yeah.
for mixing opinion. And I wrote this down. One of the things that you complained about was that, and I'm going to quote now. This is a New York Times. Trump's strategy seems to upend a world in which he has publicly called for suspending the Constitution, vowed to turn political opponents into legal targets, and suggested the nation's top military general should be executed. As an editor, I think I could have had that worded a little bit better. But everything in there is true.
You think it's true, and a lot of us might think it's true, but it is a statement of opinion. It's using facts to marshal an opinion.
Well, that's an interesting distinction, but I'm not sure it's really different.
Let me give you a different
Okay.
side of that argument. This is really a labeling question, and what it really has to do with is kind of a boring point if you think about it. When there was a New York Times, just a newspaper, when we all got the newspaper, the magazine would come, and the magazine would be magazine articles, and you sort of got the idea that a magazine article has a voice, has opinions. It didn't have to be labeled that way. I mean, I wrote 3 articles that I can think of for the New York Times Magazine that were highly opinionated in my voice, my view of what I thought of certain facts related to education reform, the bailing out of the banks. I forget what one of the other ones was, but they had my opinion in them. But today, that same article, take the 1619 Project, for example, would appear on the website, and our quibble is it's not labeled as opinion. And a lot of magazine articles, and I'm not knocking magazine articles, I've made my living as a magazine writer with a lot of opinions, but they're not labeled sufficiently so people can get confused into thinking they're reading a New York Times news report. So we had discussions with the Times about this, and we said, a lot of your criticism in your art section, your magazine articles, your special projects are unlabeled opinion, and they are different in tone and substance from your straight news reports. And they actually sort of readily agreed with us and said, well, what are we supposed to do? And I said, well, we say in small print sometimes magazine over the headline of the thing that might appear on the homepage on a Sunday, but it's opinion. And they could fix that by labeling. I could fix that for them in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It's not about the quality of the New York Times, the quality of what they do. We probably, we both agree that it's very high quality. It's just the way we look at things at NewsGuard is how does a consumer who doesn't know it's the New York Times, they see a headline, they click on it, and they start reading an article. How do they know that they're being asked to share an opinion as opposed to being given what I'll call straight news?
Steve, how much of a problem or how much of this is related to the decline of newspapers in America? A little community that my wife went to, Canadian Texas, for 100 years had a newspaper which, a couple thousand people, maybe a few more live there. They lost that paper. Now they don't even have a website down there now. And Pittsburgh and Salt Lake, they do have, a news website, but they don't have that daily newspaper. And I wonder how much you think more people turn to social media and don't apply the same criteria they would apply if reading a newspaper story.
Well, I'm not sure I quite agree with the sequence of your question.
Okay.
I think the reason there are not now a lot of local newspapers is so many people have turned to social media for what they think is news. And you combine that with the idea that there are
Programmatic advertising.
there are all these hoax local news sites and all this other stuff. People in that people in that community think they see news,
Yeah.
but it might not be news.
That's not the New York Times calling.
So I think, so the decline, I mean, that decline is real, but it's exacerbated,
To be sure.
by the fact that so many people get their news from social media that, again, if you think about where the advertising goes where people go. And there's another thing that really is part of this problem. One of the early chapters of the book, I described the experience of a woman, Renee DeResta, who in 2013 moves out to Silicon Valley. She's a techie, and she has a newborn baby. And she doesn't have too many friends out there who have babies, so she goes online just to sort of get the basic facts about what should the vaccine regimen be for her baby. And she goes on Facebook and sees this vehement debate about the most benign thing in the world, a measles vaccine. And the more she reads this stuff, the more Facebook sends her the stuff. And the more they send her that stuff, that conspiracy theory, the more she starts getting sent other conspiracy theories. So she knows enough about the technology and has enough friends that she texts a few of her friends and says, I'm looking at this stuff about vaccines. What's up with your recommendation algorithm? I'm getting all this crap. And they basically tell her, well, in so many words, that's the way it works. She is now one of the leading advocates for reform of the social media platform. She has a really terrific new book out about her experiences. She has run a group at Stanford University that monitors this, that has just been shut down because they were so harassed by the House Judiciary Committee that Stanford apparently decided it wasn't worth the legal fees to keep doing it.
Wow. Section 230, which basically, you can explain what it does and why you think it ought to be, I think you said, modestly changed.
Right. Well, I only dwell on how it could be changed legislatively because I think that's sort of a waste of time since we live in a world where Congress can't name a post office. So why spend a lot of time talking about?
Except it can close down a good site at Stanford University,
yeah.
Right?
Well, a congressional committee can with the right subpoenas. That's true. What Section 230 was a well-meaning bill. In fact, it was called the Good Samaritan Act, and it was 3 paragraphs in a multi-hundred-page piece of legislation passed in 1996 before there were social media platforms. There was no notice when this legislation in 1996 was passed. It was all about new regulations for the brand new cell phone and cable television industries. Not a word was said about social media platforms because they didn't exist. What did exist, many of you will recall, were 3 dial-up companies, AOL, Prodigy, and CompuServe, where you would spend $5 or $10 a month. You'd get email, and you could also go online and contribute into chat rooms with people who had a mutual interest with, the New York Yankees or food or travel or finance. And as it happened, as those platforms started to get more people on them, but again, a fraction of the people using social media, someone said something defamatory about someone on one of the platforms, and that person sued the platform. Someone said something defamatory about someone else on one of the other platforms. That person sued the platform. One of the platforms had taken the position, we don't screen or block or censor anything. Whatever you write on our platform is there. The other one said, well, we want to screen and check what's on our platform for profanity, profanity, for hate speech, for defamatory content. The one that said we don't do anything was held completely immune from liability. The one that said, well, we try to make this a better place, they were held liable. So there were 4 or 5 members of Congress who just didn't think that was a very smart result because, the good guys were being penalized and the not so good guys were being let off scot-free. So they passed what, again, was called the Good Samaritan Act, meant to protect the Good Samaritans who screened what went on their platforms. Again, it took me like 20 minutes to figure out the fraction of traffic that these platforms had compared to Facebook and Google. It's something like 1/3 billionth or something. It's just, it just doesn't compare. So at age 11, Mark Zuckerberg became a Good Samaritan, totally immune from liability. They've never changed the law. And what that means is somewhere in this room, I guarantee there is a sign that says occupancy by more than X number of people is dangerous and unlawful. That's a fire safety regulation. So when the social media platforms tell you, well, so many people want to post videos and text online, we can't screen it all. We can't stop someone from posting a video of a mass murder at a mosque in New Zealand. We can't stop someone from urging people to come to the Capitol to have a riot because there's so much being posted. Well, that's ridiculous. Why are they the only enterprise that is allowed to take as much business as they can, spend as little as they want to make sure it's safe, whereas nobody else can do that? Take Elon Musk. He owns a car company. If he said, I really have to improve my profit margins and I have to speed up my production because so many people want my cars, so I'm going to get rid of these pesky airbags and seat belts, let alone the software that keeps the car maybe from driving over a cliff, so I can just put out as many Teslas as I can. He'd never be allowed to do that. And if the government let him do it, the courts would hold him responsible. He can do that with Twitter with total impunity. So you can post on Twitter that if you take this cocktail of handy drugs that are in your medicine cabinet at home and you're a teenage girl, you will spontaneously get an abortion, which is not true. You will maybe spontaneously die. But he can post that. He's not responsible for that. That's what Section 230 has wrought. The reason I don't think, again, that we should spend a lot of time, at least in this year, talking about how it can be repealed, is there is a tool available right now. The Federal Trade Commission is charged with enforcing the contracts that companies make with their customers. Those contracts include the terms of service that you all see when you go online. The Facebook terms of service lists all the things it won't tolerate. It won't tolerate hate speech. It won't tolerate harmful misinformation. It won't tolerate state-sponsored disinformation. It won't tolerate, bullying of, teenagers. It's basically a list of all the stuff they do tolerate. And then it's a list of all the stuff they say they don't like, but they go to Congress every 6 months and apologize for and say, well, we're trying really, really hard. We're really, really sorry. But, so many people want to post on our platform that there's just, so much we can do. But by the way, we're really, really sorry. And we're trying really, really hard. And we know we have to do better. And did we mention that we're really, really sorry? Well, what's the FTC doing? They can make them really, really sorry. The FTC has enforced another aspect of the terms of service, which are the privacy policies that Facebook promises. And the FTC's collected billions of dollars in those enforcement actions. They could do that today. And if you want to help them, you can go to the FTC website where you can all, with one click, you can file a complaint.
I'm going to ask one question and then turn it over to you all, but I want everyone who wants to ask a question to come to that microphone. So why don't you start to line up now, And as you line up, Steve, you also, in the context of polarization, talk about the need for various political reforms like ranked choice voting or two-tier primaries or gerrymandering your district. How much of a difference do you think that would make?
I think it would make a lot of difference. I think the political reforms I suggest, which are really meant to depolarize the country, would really deprive the demagogues and the hucksters and the hoaxsters of the oxygen they have and the encouragement they have that has allowed them so successfully to take advantage of the social media platforms and the financial support of programmatic advertising. So it's those two seemingly unrelated things. The political reforms, and again, it doesn't take Congress. A citizens ballot initiative is available in, I think, a majority of the states where you could put something on the ballot and say, let's get rid of partisan, gerrymandering. No one's in favor. Who even will speak in favor of partisan gerrymandering?
The Republicans.
You could do that. And what that would do is it would make it, if you step back and think about it, partisan gerrymandering is the political equivalent of recommendation algorithms. Recommendation algorithms force people into their separate corners. You read what you want to read, and she reads what she wants to read. That's what the recommendation algorithms do on social media. What partisan gerrymandering does is it puts you in an election district, whether it's state legislative or congressional, with all the people who agree with you. So then what happens is the contest is who is the most extreme in agreeing with you. So you get the most extreme Republicans and the most extreme people on the Democratic side. A partisan primary is exactly the same thing. I run in the Republican primary, I've got to prove I'm the most Republican. I run in a Democratic primary, I've got to prove I'm the most Democratic. If instead you had what California has, which is a two-tier primary, a top two, where you run in a primary and then the two people, Democrat or Republican, who get the most votes, they have a runoff against each other. And the dynamic there is you're incented to appeal to the center, not to the crazy people on the left or the right.
So the voters choose the politician rather than the politician choosing the voters.
Yep.
Which is the way it works now. You all have been really patient, and why don't you start off?
I'm Caroline Poplin, formerly Cookie Poplin, widow of Marty Slate. I think we were all at Yale Law School at about the same time. The New York Times, I think the argument you make about opinion and facts is very legalistic. What do you think of their statement, all the news that's fit to print?
I think that's a great statement, and I agree. They should print all the news that's fit to print, and they should also include all the opinion that they want to print. But there's a difference between news and opinion, and I will say that it is so rare to hear someone who is a graduate of Yale Law School being accused of being legalistic. that it's really refreshing.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stan Kroc, former colleague of Al's.
Hi, Stan.
I have a comment and a question. I agree with you, Al. That sentence that you read is factual. If the following sentence had been, and therefore he's unfit to be president, that would be opinion. And I distinguish between the two. The question I have is this. In the book, The Ugly Truth About Facebook, there's an anecdote that Facebook at one point changed the algorithm for its news feed so that more accurate sources would be at the top of the news feed. And they found out that that reduced engagement, so they junked that effort. So the news feed then became what you would predict. How do you make these companies be responsible?
By holding them responsible. So, for example, that would be a good example of how that would be good evidence demonstrating that they're violating their terms of service, right? Second, if you do get to the point, and I think there is a good legal case to be made that they are editors, and therefore having immunity from editing is totally ridiculous. I mean, what Facebook did during the 2020 election to the voting machine companies, Smartmatic and what's the other one? Dominion.
Or
They
right.
they posted posted the same misinformation and disinformation that Fox did. But Fox engaged in its own algorithm, recommendation engine on a television channel, not on a social media platform, and that's why Fox could be held liable. What Fox did was they put people on who took one point of view, they egged them on, they agreed with them, they never presented the second point of view, which is there was an honest election. And that's what Facebook did, that's what Twitter did, and they did not get sued the way Fox got sued. Now, a couple of people who had deep pockets who said those things on Facebook and Twitter, such as Rudy Giuliani, whose pocket's not that deep anymore, have been sued. The guy from, Smart Pillow, whatever it is.
Pillow, Mike Liddell.
Yeah, the Pillow guy's been sued. But that really illustrates the point. And, I was reading this morning that Facebook and the platforms are arguing against the current proposals dealing with smartphones and kids, saying that the proposal would say that any platform that has an algorithm, has to do certain things to protect kids. That's the core of these proposals. And what Facebook is arguing is, well, you need our algorithm because we're editors, and it's unconstitutional to tell us we can't have an algorithm. And yet when they argue for immunity under Section 230, they say, we are not editors. You can't do both.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lori Sostowski. I'm from the neighborhood. I was wondering, when you are looking at reporting stories for grading them, do you have some sort of algorithm or counting system that looks at adjectives and adverbs? Because I think that's one interesting place where you find it. And how would you rate, say, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal on that kind of metric?
We don't have any algorithms that do any of that. We have people who are trained as journalists. There isn't a formula. It's not done by one person. Any kind of close call will involve 10 or 15 of us at a time having a meeting and deciding on something. And we're just not good at those kind of metrics. The closest thing we have to dealing with a metric is we have one criteria that says, do you gather and present news responsibly? In that situation, if a website has made and continues to make really significant errors that really count, but the overall content on the website is accurate, they will get dinged for that. The other criteria, which counts for more points, is if you repeatedly publish false news, there our standard is on any given day, when you look at the homepage, you're going to see something that's just provably false. Fruit pits cure cancer. They still haven't decided who got the most votes in Arizona. You name it. But we really depend on human judgment with all of its frailties. What we also depend on is that we are obsessively transparent. So we explain everything we're doing. We don't do anything without calling the website for comment. If we're going to change something, we call them for comment. Right now, there are 4 different companies that rate the reliability of news and information online. There's Facebook, there's Twitter, there's Google, and there's us. If you're the editor of the Washington Post, whoever he or she may be today,
if you can answer that, Steve.
and you want to know, how does my rating compare to the New York Times? And you want to know that from Facebook or Twitter, first of all, you wouldn't know whom to call. If you figured out whom to call, they wouldn't tell you. And if they told you and you said, well, how did you do that? They wouldn't tell you how they do it because they'd say, well, you'll game our system. And if you wanted to complain about it, they wouldn't make your complaint public. You wouldn't even know who to complain to. With us, again, we want you to game our system. Our labels give you the context for everybody who's involved in that. And everything we do has to bear the test of that kind of transparency, which means when we get stuff wrong, and we often do, we are accountable for it. And I think that is the best way to ensure quality control. Just as I always tell my Yale students, the best way to do fact checking and to sleep at night before you write something that's really tough is to talk to the person you're writing something tough about, put every question in front of that person explicitly, not beat around the bush because you don't have the guts to say, I'm about to say you're a murderer. You've got to say that. Or you're a swindler or whatever it is you're going to say, because that person has the most knowledge and the most vested interest in proving that you're wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Steve, as we wait that next question, do you deal with and evaluate the use of anonymous sources?
Only in the context of whether something is publishing responsibly. So, for example, I remember this vaguely. I think TMZ is one website. It's sort of a gossipy website that really, at least to my memory of what our nutrition label looks like, only uses anonymous sources. Right. And we just think that's just not responsible. So they fail on that criteria. But everybody, to some degree, uses anonymous sources, but you sort of want to hold them to some account. There's something we don't do that I'm trying to figure out a way we can do this at NewsGuard, but it's just my pet peeve. How many times have you read in the last week that some great killer story in the New York Times, and it says, we interviewed more than 60 people for this story. What is that about? Don't they know how many people they interviewed? If you don't, a while back, I think I talked the Washington Post out of doing that, so they now say how many people they interviewed. But that's the ultimate accountability. But if you don't know that, and if you don't disclose it, it's a figure of speech. Is more than 60, 61, or 6,000? Why aren't you at least accountable for how many people you interviewed? Now, I say that as someone whose first page of the first book he wrote was a preface, the first sentence of which was, I interviewed more than 300 people for this book.
But you learned.
Yeah.
The classic example of that was Christie and Stan, my alma mater, the Wall Street Journal, did a piece a couple of weeks ago on how Biden was slipping. Oh, right. And it had all example. Anonymous quotes. They said they interviewed more than 40 people, I think. And the only person they quoted by name was Kevin McCarthy.
Right.
And I'm not sure the story was wrong, but it was incredible.
What does more than 40 people mean?
Yeah.
If it was 41, why don't you just say we interviewed 41 people? That sounds like a lot. Plus, if you think about it as a writer, the image you create for the reader is some reporter scurrying around talking to 41 people. If you just use a figure of speech more than 40, it's so vague that you don't create that image.
Thank you both, and especially thank you to Politics and Prose for always having these interesting conversation. I feel like I'm missing...
You can tell us who you are?
Yes, I'm Sharon Fine. I moved here in 1989 to work on Capitol Hill. But anyway, I feel like I'm missing a piece of the puzzle, and I apologize if you addressed this in the beginning of your talk. I like this misinformation, these gross, like down the street, the Pizzagate and Pelosi's husband. Like, is there any factual credibility? Like, how I'm missing the piece of how decent human beings are believing these horrific stories.
Well, two parts of that answer. One is there's always something.
Okay, so there.
No, not something bad. Don't mishear what I said. There's always something. It is true that Nancy Pelosi's husband got attacked, right?
Okay.
They didn't just pick someone out of the blue. It is true that Comet Pizza sells pizza, right?
Oh, goodness.
It always
That's all
starts
they
with
need?
something.
Oh,
No,
my
but
goodness.
it is true that Hank Aaron died. Then if you say, well, he died from the COVID vaccine, so they use little strands of truth to then explode in a way that I guarantee none of us in this room really quite
But
understand.
where and how
But
did we
people
get there?
believe it because people don't believe in the basics anymore.
Okay.
People don't believe, people don't believe their doctors. One of the other things that I write about with this woman, Renee DeResta, is she ends up, after she has a little trouble getting vaccine information, she reads, she's a really scholarly researcher. She reads this research piece by some Canadian academic who found that in 2013, more people were getting healthcare information from Google than their own doctors. Worse yet, she then, this was a real academic, she then did like a sample of 4,000 different references on Google to some healthcare stuff and found that the overwhelming majority of the information provided was not from doctors or other healthcare professionals, just from people who had an opinion about the disease.
We have time for, Brad's giving me a very evil eye right now. We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi. Yeah, I'm just
Is that a
on
good
the-
compromise?
Hi, on this nexus between responsible journalists and the internet.
You are going to tell us who you are, right?
I'm James Graff. I was recently with the Wall Street Journal. We'll soon be with another local paper, but I can't announce that. Facebook has said it's pulling back from news because it's so problematic, right? On the one hand, newspapers have found that they're not trying to get search stuff anymore because they can't figure out what Google's algorithm's always changing. So they're trying to get native content. You see you want to go to the New York Times, you want to play games, you want to stay there for 4 hours. That's the metric they're looking at now. So I'm wondering if you see that as any kind of untangling of this, or is that just a local phenomenon of the papers that are big enough to pull in that kind of stuff, that kind of readership?
Well, I think they're trying to add to their business model, but I think you missed the headline. You worked at the Journal. You just referred to the New York Times, and you're talking about 2 newspapers among more than a few, but they're not the majority, who have proven that, as the population of this bookstore proves, that people will actually pay for good content.
But Huffington Post does the same thing. They're trying to get away from search.
But the Huffington Post is nothing like, don't tempt me here, but it's nothing like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
I'm just, yeah, okay, fair enough.
I mean,
One more.
let me put it to this. So one of the things I tell my students at Yale is that the good news is that in the history of the world, it is, or certainly of Western democracies, it is almost impossible to find the quality news organization that made it as a business without charging for their content, that made it totally on advertising. So the Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, you name it, it is not surprising to me that none of them make it without being able to demand something from the people who are reading their content. And the good news for my students is that means that you are the product. You are not stuff that runs around the ads. You are the product.
One more question. That woman has been waiting very patiently.
Thank you, and thank you all for making the time. My name is Libby Snowden. I actually just graduated from Yale, and I took a class with Joanne Littman where we talked about very many of these things. So it's been
Joanne's
great.
terrific.
She's awesome. Absolutely love that class. One thing I just was curious about, we've got Net Choice versus Paxton. Probably that decision's coming out here in the next week or 2. And I was just curious if you think the decision on that is going to change how we talk about Section 230, and if so, how?
Well, that's another instance where, if you think about it, the platforms are being totally hypocritical. They're saying, we're not editors, so don't hold us responsible, right? No, I'm sorry. Yeah, that whoever that person is in the back is right. What they're saying is we're the editors, so you can't. It's unconstitutional to stop us from doing what we do. But again, in Section 230, they say, well, we're not editors, so we're not responsible for what we do. But I think that law is going to be struck down. I think everybody agrees with that.
You all have been a fabulous audience, and Steve, you've given a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
The Death of Truth. If you haven't read it, get it and read it. And thank you so much.
So